You're listening to a podcast by the Center for Action and Contemplation. To learn more, visit cac.org.
Greetings, I'm Jim Finley.
And I'm Kirsten Oates.
Welcome to Turning to the Mystics.
Welcome everyone to Season 10 of Turning to the Mystics, where we're turning to T.S. Eliot and the four quartets. I'm here with Jim to discuss his first session, and welcome, Jim.
Yes, good to be together like this and share these teachings with the listeners.
And I absolutely loved the first session, diving into this poetry, and I thought it might be helpful just for you to give us a few words about how to settle into a poem like this.
Here's the thing about poetry, and I'm thinking now, when I was in the monastery, we chanted the Psalms, which are poetry. And when I first went, we chanted it in Latin, like back and forth. And here's the thing, the poetic voice is not the voice that defines or explains. Mm-hmm. It's rather a voice that evokes sensitivities to the interior dimensions of our life. And that's the poetic voice. St. John of the Cross, for example, or Meister Eckhart, even when they're doing the teaching, there's a poetic intonation to the way they talk.
Yes.
But the poetry is kind of the distilled state of an evocative language, a logos. And so T.S. Eliot, that's why we're turning to the poet.
Yes.
See, this mystic.
Like a concentrated time with this experience, yeah.
And that's why to get into it, you have to tease it out.
Yeah.
See, it's so condensed, but that requires an inner work of the spirit, like a meditative sitting, to keep teasing it open, to see how it's true in your own life and how we engage in it, or it engages us.
Yeah, because that's what's so wonderful about the poem is where you recognize yourself or you recognize that sensation in your own life.
Yes. The way I look at it, too, is that clarity with the interiority of our lives cannot be found in linear explanatory language. It has to be like the language that's evocative, and like the language of love, the language of silence, the language of beauty. And so that's that poetic language, that poetic voice allows us to find a logos, or a word that explores these interior spiritual dimensions of our life.
Well, it's wonderful to have your guidance as we step into that. I wanted to start with where you started in that session, talking about this big theme for the poem, really for the four quartets as a whole, which is that we're going to be learning about experiential salvation. Yeah. And you also talked about how T.S. Eliot experienced a lot of suffering, and perhaps this insight into experiential salvation is connected to all the suffering that he experienced. And I wondered if you could help me understand that connection.
Yes. For T.S. Eliot, the autobiographical foundations for the poem is the suffering in his life at the societal level of living through 2 world wars, and at the tragic falling apart of his marriage. And so in his earlier poem, The Wasteland, it gave voice to that darkness. But then later on with Ash Wednesday and in this poem, as in his own life, you see the light of faith shining through in a transformative way, that experiential salvation, to be delivered from the tyranny of suffering in the midst of suffering. Yeah.
So that is interesting, Jim, that his first poetry that came out of that deep suffering was really capturing emotional despair. Like there wasn't a sense of hope in it. And people were drawn to that poetry because it was reflective of how people were feeling, I guess.
Yes. Yeah. It gives voice to the tragic. And if it gives voice to it, it allows us to listen to it and be present to it in a meaningful way by acknowledging it.
But it took him time to then explore and have this, I guess, his own personal experience of experiential salvation to come back around and deepen his poetry with this part of his experience.
That's right. And so what the poem does with Bert Norton, so we're at a scene where in the past a tragic event occurred, or a scene where there was suffering. But then he's inviting us to find the presence of God in the traumatizing places of our life. See, the whole poem is like a meditation drawing us into that same realization within ourselves. And the poem helps us to explore that.
And do you think, Jim, just given the way his life unfolded and the way the poetry unfolded, that often it takes time away from the tragic event to be able to come back and have this experiential salvation? We might not be expected to feel it in the midst of the traumatizing event, but perhaps years later, months later.
It goes different ways, especially with major trauma where you're just flooded. And also the cumulative effect of a series of little traumas, little losses, betrayals, and so on. It requires some time to get some distance, to reflect upon it, to get some perspective. But what can also happen is the light can shine while the trauma is actually occurring. That happens also. So it goes both ways. Yeah.
And then this experience of salvation, this is an inner experience?
Well, I want to approach it from the standpoint of the poem, how he approaches it. So let's say in the opening lines of the poem, see, time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future. So he's inviting us to reflect on how we experience our passage through time, from birth to death. And what he's saying is, if we reflect on time, we can see that time present, this present moment we're in right now, and the event in the past that happened to us, especially painful events in the past, that we carry with us and remember in the present, or perhaps in time future, namely, no matter how many years ahead we move, the tragic thing that happened in the past will always have been what happened in the past. And therefore, if all time is present, if that's all time is, it's unredeemable because it's set. And so the question would be the question of the redemption of time. And we noted too in the reflection that psychotherapy does this, and that what happens in therapy is you're with someone who invites you in the present, with your present level of understanding, to look back at what happened in the past, to be able to see from your present standpoint what you were unable to see when it happened, and how you internalize those confusions. So you come to a more reality-based, or more spacious, or more gracious. So it has this liberating, healing effect. But notice, see, that's still in time. There's a better future ahead, but it's a future in time. So the poem has something much more radical in mind. Because to go through the first gate, what is the very first gate? And in the light of the whole poem, the opening words of the book of Genesis, in the beginning, God said, let there be light. And that's the first gate. See, that's the path we didn't take. We didn't consider that. And that's the door we never opened. We never opened the door of God. We didn't open the door of eternity. So then he invites us to say, let's open it now. Let's look at it and let the light of our faith shine on our present understanding of for eternity, kind of shines out through time and transcends it. And the poem starts us down that path. I'm
just really amazed by having my own eyes open to this sense of being so unconsciously kind of identified with time. And so I really appreciate this opportunity to look at that in this poem. And so when you're talking about the experiential salvation as a theme for this poem, certainly for Burnt Norton, we're talking about being saved from being identified with time and our circumstances in time.
Yes, we're being saved from the illusion that the only reality of who we are is the reality that's limited by time. In other words, we'll put it another way, the way we said it. If we think that our beginning was where we emerged in time with conception and birth and so on, and then when we die, we'll disappear as mysteriously as we came. It's over. But what if our beginning isn't where we were born? What if our beginning is where we appeared in time, out of the eternal depths of God, knowing who we eternally are, hidden with Christ in God forever? And so we appeared in time. And likewise, when we disappear in time, we're not annihilated. The circle completes itself, and we circle back into the eternality of ourselves. in God. And so the poem is opening up that spiritual worldview, this way of looking at things spiritually.
Beautiful. And then helping us find it in day by day
That's the point.
life.
That's right.
Yeah, lovely. Well, Jim, can we go back to that first part? I'd love to just see if I'm tracking with you and really understanding this concept of time. So time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future. So what I heard you kind of reference is I may have experienced a trauma or a wounding experience in my past. There may be things in my past that I wish hadn't happened, whether they were done to me or whether I'd caused suffering to someone else. And when I reflect on those things, they can bring me straight back into that same pain right now in the present. And a lot of people have that experience, that the event is well and truly over, but the pain lives on in the body.
That's right. And in terms of mental health, like post-traumatic stress disorder, a triggering event is anything in the present that reminds you of the past. The body will re-experience it, the somatic, emotional level. And that's the self in time. And then your future is more of the same.
Yes.
Because that past will always be your past.
Right.
So if that's true, then it's unredeemable, meaning there's no deliverance from the tyranny of the unfolding of sequential time.
Yeah. So, and time future contained in time past, that's what you were just saying, like this can go on and on. So if all time is eternally present, all time is unredeemable because it's filled with suffering.
That's right.
Yeah. And the other thing that came to mind as I reflected on this was the historical context for this as well. So there's like my own life where there's been suffering and it repeats on in my body and my experience. But, you know, as a world, as a society, there's been suffering that creates a sense of resentment in a culture, you know, and the war from hundreds of years past is still present in the minds and hearts of the people. Yeah.
It is. It's like the war in Ukraine. We've been here before.
Yeah.
And so a whole lineage of past invasions, past wars, past prejudices, past, you know, this tragic kind of cyclic repetition in the present. And so what is a graced way where that doesn't have the final say in our situation? It doesn't have the final say in what the world really looks like through awakened eyes. Like, how did Jesus see the world? And how can we learn to see the world through Christ's eyes? And the poem is really kind of a prayer, you know, kind of helping us to do that.
Yes. It's so helpful in the first instance to recognize how perhaps unconsciously we are so attached to time, the way he's laying this out. So the next thing he says is about what might have been an abstraction remaining a perpetual possibility only in a world of speculation. What might have been and what has been point to one end, which is always present. And so this part made me think about, you know, when you reflect on things in your life that still cause you suffering, you can often go to, I wish I hadn't done that, I should have done this. And so it can kind of double down on the suffering. Yeah.
I wished I hadn't done it, or I wished it wasn't done to me. But I did do that. And it was done to me. And so the coulda, woulda, shoulda. See, what could have happened, it didn't happen, is always what could have happened, but never didn't happen, and it never will happen, because it's over.
Yes.
There's a whole different way to look at this.
Yeah.
To take the passage we didn't take and to open a door we didn't open, which is eternity.
Yes. Because right now it feels very claustrophobic. In looking at these first number of lines, it feels very claustrophobic, like there's no way out of perpetual suffering, and in my life and in the world as it unfolds.
Yeah. And I think he's also saying here, when he talks about that lost look in the faces of people, we tend to walk around lost in time, but we're not emotionally aware of it. We're so atmospherically present.
Yes.
How unawake we are to the eternal depths that's pouring out through and transcending time.
Yes.
And so he's trying to, it's like a wake-up call to be awakened to the eternity that transcends and is permeating time. It transcends time.
Yes, yeah. Yes, it's so helpful because time is ethereal also in a way.
Yeah.
So to be so attached to it and so, at the behest of how it's unfolding it's so helpful to see that. Yeah. So then he says, footfalls echo in the memory, down the passage we did not take, towards the door we never opened, into the rose garden. My words echo thus in your mind. And so this is where you say, let's open the door to something deeper, something.
That's right. Yeah. And notice what he's doing here, into the rose garden, because now he said, let's open the door of eternity, what burnt Norton looks like in the light of eternity.
Yes.
And in a way, he's creating an imaginary scene.
Yeah.
That's a metaphor for reality. So it's like a waking dream. It's concretized in this place, but this really place helps to concretize our own experience.
Yes.
Of how we can be awakened to our own past and eternity in our own life. So that's how he's kind of the delicacy of what he's doing here.
Yes. Yes, it's so clever how he's going to something so real and concrete, that we can learn about a real story, real lives.
Yeah.
It's a real place that people can go to.
Another way to look at it, too, is in literature in general, or in film. Mm-hmm. You're watching these people on the screen, and especially if it's a very deep film about human life and whatever. And so when the credits are rolling up, people just sit there because they realize it's them.
Yeah.
Like whoever wrote that knows the interior scripts of our heart. And what happened to them is really helping us to see ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
So just a reminder, Burnt Norton is a real house in England, and it was the site of where a terrible tragedy took place, where there was an unhappy marriage and the husband burnt down this mansion, Burnt Norton.
He killed his wife.
He killed his wife first.
Set the mansion on fire and killed himself.
And he died in the fire.
He died in the fire. And that's the scene where we have Burnt
the
Norton, the charred ruins, like a primordial scene of the tragic, which represents the tragic moments throughout the whole world in our life and so on.
So we could think about returning to the scene of Burnt Norton, almost we can return to our own tragic moments as well.
That's right, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's keep going. So now we follow into the garden, but to what purpose disturbing the dust on a bowl of rose leaves? I do not know. Other echoes inhabit the garden. Shall we follow? Quick, said the bird. Find them, find them. I do love the way the bird in nature, because I do think nature is such a gateway into this type of thing.
Yes, there's two things here. Mm-hmm. But to what purpose? In other words, the practical mind trapped in linear time isn't sensitized to these layers in which the deliverance we're looking for lies hidden. Because it's beyond purpose, or it's like a deeper purpose the linear self can't grasp. And there's other echoes, meaning this. It's true that tragedy happened here, but it's not the only thing that's here. Mm-hmm. There are other echoes. And now we're trying to take in a more inclusive sensitivity to these other echoes. The song of the bird and the children laughing in the trees. So it starts opening up these kind of celestial dimensions that are there. Mm-hmm. Because they're everywhere.
Yeah, yeah. So we follow the bird and we get to this swimming pool.
Yeah.
And he talks about it being a drained pool full of leaves. And then this amazing scene of the sunlight filling the pool. And he experiences like water in the pool.
Yes.
Yeah. And then ghosts appear.
That's
the
right.
dead appear. Yeah.
That's right. Because this is a key moment, really.
Yeah. By the way, Jim, when you talked about this moment in the session, your clock chimed, right? When you started talking about the dead.
Yeah. I want to say this is so important because this is a radical shift. Mm-hmm. What I made a reference to is when I was in the monastery, an old lay brother died. And Thomas Burnt was talking to the novices about death. And he says, it's so helpful to know that when we die, we don't go anywhere. Because it says in Scripture, in Acts, in God we live and move and have our being. So we're actually not just in our life through time, but we're living our life in the vast interiority of God. And We're created by God in the image and likeness of God as the manifested presence of God in the vast interiority of God. And with us are the dead, those who have crossed through the veil of death are in eternity. And all the angels are here. All the saints are here. And so all of a sudden, it's like in a deep meditative state. It's raising a very deep question this way. See, we can't see the dead for the same reason we can't see God. See meaning to realize the felt sense of their presence. Because we're eternal, nobody dies. All of us are eternal. So all the dead are there, the communion of saints. All of a sudden, all the dead are with us. And they're our guests, like we welcome the dead. They're our guests. And I like where he says, they're accepted, we accept them as well we should. And they're accepting, they accept us. Because they know we'll be joining them soon enough. We're all in this together. And that's when they go into the empty pool of the crusty leaves and so on. But it's water made of sunlight. And then a stunning image where you're leaning forward, looking at your reflection in the water. And over your shoulder, you can see all the dead looking with you in the water. And the cloud passes and they're gone, but they're not gone. You just can't see them. But even though you can't see them, you know that they're there. And the poem is also trying to help us see that.
Yes, amazing.
It is amazing. Yeah.
So what is kind of being revealed to us that as we're walking down towards this pool behind us, we didn't see it, but there's like a procession of the dead, almost like a liturgical procession going on behind us.
That's right.
And then when we arrive at the pool, we're given the gift of this sunlight as a reflective light, and the faces of the dead are glittering.
And there's another insight here, I think, that will run through the whole poem, is that when we look at our own moments of awakening, like where we're quickened, we're in consciousness, not in time, you get the intuition that it rings true. You can't explain it. It's an intensification of presence. And when the moment passes, it isn't as if in those moments of quickening, something more is given to us, but rather in the moments of quickening, we fleetingly glimpsed what every moment deep down really is. We can't see it, but we know that it's there.
Yeah.
And it's starting to raise this whole question about longing to abide habitually in what our heart knows is there because we experienced it. So the presence of God.
That beautiful scene, and they were behind us reflected in the pool. Then a cloud passed by and the pool was empty. There's that sense of not being in that experience anymore, but you can carry the memory, the assuredness of what you experienced in your heart.
That's exactly right. You experienced what your own awakening heart was graced to realize. In faith, you know that it's true. You know that it's true. I like to say, Thomas Merton, he said, there's some things in life we simply have to accept or we go crazy inside. And they're the very things we can't explain to anybody, including ourselves. And this is what we accept that we know is true in the awakening of our own heart. I will not play the cynic. I will not doubt my awakened heart. And so he's trying to help us stabilize in the sensitivity of experiential faith.
And this line where he says, go, 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 said the bird, humankind cannot bear very much reality. Is he pointing to the fact that it is hard for us to trust those moments and to be assured by them and to carry them forward in our hearts?
It's kind of like this. One, we can't stand very much reality in time. Life's just too much. I don't know about you. But not only that, we can't stand very much reality in what transcends what we're able to grasp, what we're able to manage. There's this myopic fixation we can't stand. But deeper down is this. It would be so sad if the only thing that was real is what we were able to manage. It would be myopic and lost. There'd be no transcendence. So we can't stand much reality, but we can't stand being experientially cut off from the boundaryless nature of reality, which is the ultimacy of ourself in God.
Yes.
And that's how the poem is this way, because the poem is almost too much. You know, it really is. And so the poem kind of embodies that richness of the too much and invites us to keep slowing down the way we are right now, to kind of settle down into the subtleties of these matters. You know.
Yeah. Jim, you compared this scene, this kind of opening scene that he takes us through, you compared it to Golgotha, otherwise known as Calvary. Can you help me understand that comparison?
Yeah, we're kind of looking ahead here at this point. This is where this is headed. Because in the beginning, the mythic story of Adam and Eve, God created us as persons in the image and likeness of God, and then endowed us with the nature to realize the transsubjective divinity of ourselves, hidden with Christ in God forever in our eternal nothingness without God. So in the garden, their nature was luminous to the divinity of themselves and everything. And so the mystery of the fall, they were like God in their nothingness without God. But the fall is trying to be like God without God, which is the fall. And in being like God without God, we fell out of the truth of ourselves. It never left us. This is why the etymology of the word religion, religio, ligature is a binding, to be rebound to the origin. We're experientially exiled from the ultimacy that alone is real, which is the sustaining, self-giving presence of God given to us as our very life. And so in this lost state, this is where we act out the traumatizing things we do to ourselves and to each other and the world, all of it. So when Jesus then, as Christ comes, is in Jesus is God's response to this fallen state. He identifies with us as infinitely loved and precious in the very brokenness in which we can't find our way, which is the mercy of God. However tragic the tragic might be, however lost we might be, God's infinite mercy on us is oceanic and eternal and greater. And so the cross then is burnt Norton. See, the cross is, and so sometimes Golgotha means the place of the skull. And in some medieval art of the crucifixion, you'll see a human skull at the base of the cross, which is the skull of Adam, the first. So Christ is the new Adam. Because when love touches suffering, the suffering turns love into mercy. And that's the mercy of God, which is Jesus. And that's where this whole poem is headed, that we could live our life in the light of that deathless mercy of God.
So the scene of the crucifixion is the origin of what transforms burnt Norton in a way.
Yeah. That's right. At the scene of the cross, which is where the poem is headed, the scene of the cross is the infinite mercy of God overwhelming and washing away the authority of brokenness to have a say in who we are.
Okay.
It's just the infinite mercy in all directions, which is the gift of tears, which is experiential salvation. Yeah.
And so if we were tracking with this poem in our own lives and going back to scenes of tragedy in our own lives, it's that mercy and that loving presence that is more than any tragedy we've experienced.
That's right. And also, this is key too. I say God is a presence that protects us from nothing, even as God unexplainably preserves us in all things.
Yeah.
So it isn't as if the presence of God stops the tragic thing from happening.
Right.
Because God doesn't. Look at the mystery of the cross. But rather what God does is God brings us to the point of a graced awakening of the deathless nature of ourselves that transcends our own death in this infinite love of God. And so it's all circling around experiential salvation.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah.
Turning to the mystics, we'll continue in a moment.
Many of us feel increasing anger at injustice, violence, and indifference in our world today. Join us March 14th for What Do I Do With My Anger? An online gathering featuring Richard Rohr and Brian McLaren. Learn ways of transforming anger into loving action. Inspired by Father Richard's new book, The Tears of Things. Register today at cac.org/anger. That's cac.org/ANGER.
What does it mean to embody salt and light? In 2025, Richard Rohr's daily meditations turn to Jesus' timeless metaphor for reflecting love into the world. Amid this season of uncertainty, join us in living with trust, being salt and light. For 18 years, the daily meditations have inspired thousands of readers like you. Subscribe today at cac.org/saltlight2025. That's cac.org/SALTLIGHT2025.
So before we move on from part one, Jim, I just did want to go back to that reference T.S. Eliot made to the lotus flower, and one, just how beautiful it is, the way he weaves things like that in, like a little hint. And also like a respect of other traditions outside of his own faith.
That's right. These mystical lineages in all the world's great religions. And he'll do that throughout the poem. But for his own lineage is Christ. So he focuses on the mythic lineage of these dispensations of grace. For him, he's in the Christian dispensation. But he's so respectful of these dispensations of grace found in the awakenings of people all over the world and all the religions. The symbol of the lotus.
Yeah, I so appreciate that.
It's nice. It's very nice.
Yeah, very expansive. And so, Jim, you talked about the lotus being a symbol in Hinduism and in Buddhism, around a symbol of enlightenment.
In Hinduism, the 1,000-petaled lotus at the crown of the head, the rising of the Kundalini. But closer in the imagery is the Buddha being enlightened, was inclined to stay in his place of enlightenment. He said, because the world doesn't want to hear it, it goes against the grain.
Yeah.
And then he goes to the edge of the water and he sees the lotus coming up out of the mud, some higher, higher, higher. And it was right near the surface. And then he realized there are those who are ready, and he turned the wheel of the Dharma. He taught the cessation of suffering. And so the point then is to the extent we're moved by the beauty of the poem, that's who we are. We're right at the surface of the water, which is our capacity to be touched by the depth of this or the beauty of this, and so on. So it's kind of an insight into ourselves.
Also, the way that the lotus has to kind of push through mud to reveal its beauty. It's also like pushing through the suffering and
the muck and the
trauma.
mire.
Yeah, amazing. I am curious to think about, as I'm thinking about time and, you know, how claustrophobic it can become in life, I'm really curious about the role of memory and also imagination, because memory seems to trap us in time a little bit. You know, it's in our memory that we keep re-experiencing this suffering and this trauma. And so I just wonder how you think about the role of memory in relation to liberating ourselves from time.
Well, there's two things. See, one, in one sense, this present moment in our memory is not just this present moment. Because in memory, the past lives in me as remembered, with feeling tonality around what my memories are. So the memory already is a transcendence of the immediacy, like concrete immediacy. So what we're suggesting now is the memory of passing through the first gate of faith in creation. We can remember. We can look back and remember, and in the beginning God said, let there be light. So in our memory, we can remember and know that the virginal origins of God is now. We're being perpetually created now. In this present moment is God's self-donating presence, creating us in the present. And so the sacred history revealed in Scripture takes us back, which is a memory that transcends our linear memory in time.
Wow.
And takes us back to the time in which God eternally knew who we were in God before the origins of the universe.
Is this part of our nature, like being created in the image and likeness of God, that we can be drawn into this eternal memory in God, that there's a memory beyond our finite memory?
When we pray, that's just what we're doing. When we read the Scriptures in faith, that's what we're doing. When we follow T.S. Eliot in this poem, that's what we're doing now.
I'm also curious about then imagination, because when I'm reflecting on this poem and reading this poem, in my imagination, I'm taking myself to Norton, to the pool, imagining the reflection of the sunlight in the pool and the faces of the dead, you know, reflected in that. What do you think the role of imagination is in this?
In a way, it's having a vision. In a way, if you want to look at it, it's like a poetic vision, like a scene in a play. So it's an imagined moment that shines a light on the truth of ourself.
Yeah, I see.
Because the imaginary image is a sacrament in which we realize the truth of ourselves this way.
Yeah, yeah. So it's like a guide in our imagination. We can be guided towards that experiential salvation, towards those. Yeah, yeah. Wonderful. Well, let's move on to the second part that you read, which was in part 2.
Allow but a little consciousness.
Yeah. Do you want to read
Yeah.
it, Jim? That'd be great.
Yeah, sure, I'll read it. Time past and time future. Allow but a little consciousness. To be conscious is not to be in time, but only in time can the moment in the rose garden, the moment in the arbor where the rain beat, the moment in the drafty church at Smokefall, be remembered, involved with past and future. Only through time, time is conquered. I want to reflect on
Wow.
that. And here's what's interesting about this.
Yeah.
See, in Norton, it's like this cosmic scene. That in the light of this cosmic scene, he then calibrates it back to utterly simple moments in our life, this scene. Mm-hmm. And he uses these subtle examples. To be conscious, you're walking outdoors, it starts to rain, you run under the shelter of a grape arbor. And standing there, you hear these huge drops of water hitting on the leaves. This is very, very subtle, see? It's like the gate of heaven. And so to be conscious is to drop down into a meditative state. And to be conscious is a meditative interior state we're not in time, as evidenced by the fact that if there's duration to the moment of subtle attentiveness, as we move on, we have to look at our watch how much time passed because we weren't in time. Mm-hmm. And so another key point of the whole poem here is this. There are these moments, and we can learn to appreciate the moment we were delivered from the tyranny of sequential time as a homecoming. But we can't make these moments happen because they're fleeting and subtle. But what we can do is assume the interior stance that offers the least resistance to be overtaken by the grace of the consciousness that transcends time. And that's meditation. And that's what's happening in this poem. Mm-hmm. Because to follow the poem, we have to slow way down and sit with it. So it's the rendezvous in the attentiveness in which in the moment of our attentiveness is sitting with the lexia of the poem. The sitting with the lexia of a poem can become itself a deepening of consciousness in which we're not in time. And also, it's a rendezvous, we see that it has to be an habitual rendezvous because it slips away. See, the tyranny of time reinstates its claim on us. So there needs to be a fidelity to the daily rendezvous so that little by little by little, because what starts to happen where the poem is taking us is a longing to abide in the depths of God that transcends time in the midst of time. So he's moving us toward this poem as a way to pray or to meditate and to patiently sit in it like a path.
Yeah, yeah. That's, you differentiated that there's vision aspects to the poem and then path aspects. And this is, so the poem itself is a path of meditation.
The vision aspect of contemplative Christianity is that ultimately just one thing is happening. The infinite presence of God, creation, is perpetual and absolute. Only one thing is happening. The infinite presence of God is pouring itself out and presencing itself in and as the gift and the miracle of our very presence, the presence of others in all things, and our nothingness without God. That's the vision. It's the all-pervasive divinity, the immediacy of everything. Mm-hmm. That's the vision. The path, then, is moments where we're awakened to that, and these little moments under the grape arbor. Then the path is the longing to abide in it. Mm-hmm. And abiding in it is the path the poem is inviting us to sit in, because the pedagogy, the poem slows us down. So we're actually practicing this opening up of ourselves to this one thing alone that's always happening, and it's touching us in the kind of simplicity or the sincerity of our openness to the beauty of the poem.
Yeah, yeah. Amazing. So this light that he's alluding to kind of bursts forth in little ways throughout the poem, and you're drawn to continue to find it.
And then I think another thing that happens throughout the poem is this. It happens first in little moments. But then what happens is we can cultivate the subtlety. If we calibrate our heart to a fine enough scale, we start tuning into the eternity that's always happening. See, that's why if we sit in deep meditative states, we drop down to this qualitative enrichment of being more richly present to the present moment. And then how to habituate that throughout the day. So I think that's part of this also.
Yeah. I just love these lines. Allow but a little consciousness. To be conscious is not to be in time. Only through time, time is conquered. Yeah. It's a beautiful riddle. It's just a beautiful riddle. And so it makes me feel only through time is time conquered. You said it helps to have a habitual practice. So I'm going to set my clock for, 6 a.m. every morning. I'm going to set my timer for 20 minutes or 30 minutes. And
here's another way of looking at it also for the listeners. If you would make a list of your moments of quickening, some that might be very intense, but a lot of times they're like this, they're very, very subtle. Marital love is filled with these. Parenting is filled with these. Living alone is filled with these. Realizing you're being called to be a poet, or how we're moved by poetry. We're being called to be a musician, we're removed by music. Being called to a service to the community, and our love for the people that we're serving unravels our ability to live on our own terms. You look at your own moments. Then you could say, what would the daily rendezvous be, where there was no agenda, but to open yourself in receptive openness, of realizing this moment is the depth of that.
I just take such encouragement from that line, only through time is time conquered. So it's not like it can't break through so easily, or I can't use my time to commit to this daily practice, that time becomes just, I can place my attention towards it in more healthy, helpful ways.
Yes, I want to put it this way. Right now when you and I are talking like this, and the people will be listening to it later. Right now, this moment we're talking like this is a moment of time.
Yes.
But it's in this moment of time, time is being transcended in our conversation.
Yes, yes.
And when the people listen, they'll be listening in a moment of time. But insofar in a moment of time, they're attentive to what they're listening to, they're transcending time in the midst of time. And I think that's at the heart of practice and what the poem leads us to, really. Yeah.
I love it. I love it. We're unraveling the riddle, and it feels very liberating. So thank you for helping us with that. Okay, well, just on to the last section. So Jim, then you turn to part 3 of the poem, and it begins with, here is a place of disaffection. And I'm wondering if you can just help me understand the kind of disaffection that T.S. Eliot's referring to.
You look at the people walking by in the streets, there's this collective empty look in that they're disconnected from this. But then there's moments where we're awakened to this. But the daily rendezvous with God is a place of disaffection. But why is it a place of disaffection? Because nothing's happening in time. That's the double entendre, the thing.
Can you help me unpack that just a little bit more? So there's 2 places of disaffection that you're referring to.
There's the place of disaffection, of that empty look on the people's faces in the street, this collective disconnect from the eternality of our lives. But there's another place of disaffection, namely awaken to the eternity of our life, these moments where we're conscious. And then we can't make them happen, so we have a daily rendezvous of being receptively open, which is sitting with this poem, for example.
Yes.
But then the very rendezvous where we want to be healed from that disaffection is itself a place of disaffection, because nothing's happening.
Okay, yeah.
That is, nothing's happening, so we're not attaining anything, we're not overcoming anything, we're not figuring anything out, we're not proving anything. So the purgative way then, we have to be purified of our attachment to this temporal one-dimensional level, to calibrate our heart to a more interior level, where actually a great deal is happening.
I see, yeah.
But it's interior and intimate, ultimately divine, really.
And this word you're using, the purgative way, that's like a path of transformation that's been laid out in
Yes,
the
this will
Catholic
be
tradition.
later in the poem, we'll see this. The purgative way is this initial phase where we're being weaned off the habits of the mind and heart that perpetuate suffering. We're addicted to the patterns that compromise what we're looking for. But because we're attached to them, there's a purgative process of moving beyond it. The illuminative way is in the midstream, betwixt and between these two realms. We're in this luminous realm. We're much more liberated from our attachment to those patterns. But we're kind of in the midst of a deep transformation, like a luminosity to what's happening to our heart. And the unitive way then is this oneness, which is a foretaste of eternal life. It's like experientially celestial, this union that's always there. We live it. This is what these saints and mystics are about. This is what we're called to.
That's so helpful. And so we go to our meditation and like we're so hopeful that this is the path of our transformation, which it is, but the first sense we might get is this disaffection. So it's good to know that going in.
Here's another way of putting it. We can hear that it's so beautiful, but why isn't everybody doing it?
Yeah.
It's like a gift to want to do it. It's like an imperative of your awakening heart to want to do this because to let it settle and go deeper. And just sit very patiently with childlike openness to allow yourself to settle down, to allow the depth to transform you into itself, little by little by little, which is the illuminative and unitive way, this way.
He doesn't give us a lot of hope about our ability to do that with the line you ended on, distracted from distraction by distraction.
But here's the hope, I think. Distracted by distraction by distraction. Like pull a number, I'll be distracted by you later.
Yeah.
But here's the hope. We say to ourselves, that's true. And then we're not distracted. I can literally reflect upon myself addicted to the distraction. But when I sit in silence in the presence of T.S. Eliot as my teacher, I'm not distracted.
Yeah.
But I can see that my temptation to be distracted will once again reclaim me because my cell phone's going to go off. I'm already late for the next meeting. So how can I learn through my life to be established in this eternal depth of presence that's ribboned through the events of my life and not get swept away by them?
I think in today's world, when I read that line, distracted from distraction by distraction, I just think about all the apps on the phone. And it's like, I'm distracted by this app and now this app and now my email and now so easy to be distracted in our minds these days.
And I saw this study where they did a study on brain development and cell phones and users on adolescence and so on. And what they found is that through the use of the cell phone and being on the internet and so on, that they're much better at double tasking, but they're losing empathy. They're losing the depth of mission. So how do we not get swept away? And the interesting thing, all these time-saving devices were left with even less time.
Yes.
So the poem, by the very fact we see this, we're already transcending it. That's what all these mystics are, that's what the podcast is about.
Yeah, beautiful. Jim, I know you didn't cover this part of the poem, but there's a reference in this poem to John of the Cross and just the way T.S. Eliot gives a nod to the lotus flower, this symbol of the depth of the mystical in Hinduism and Buddhism. I love the way he also gives this reference to St. John of the Cross. And so it's in the last section of the poem, part 5, and it's just one line. He just says, as in the figure of the 10 stairs. So we covered John of the Cross in season 3 of our podcast, and he's a beloved mystic. So I'd love to just understand this reference a little more.
Yes, what's interesting about that? He says that as in reference to the 10 stairs, but he doesn't tell us where it's from. He doesn't mention John of the Cross.
Right. Yeah.
It's one of those things you have to look it up to know what it is.
Yeah.
So let's say the lotus rose slowly. That's an allusion then to the Hindu and the Buddhist tradition. So the reference to the 10 stairs is his first reference to the Christian tradition, which is the 16th century Spanish mystic St. John of the Cross. So I'll just read the first two, the 10 stairs. So that this is St. John of the Cross, The Dark Night, Book 2, Chapter 19. So I'll just read the first two. This is what he's referring to. The first step, and really there's steps of being transformed by love into love. The first step of love makes the soul sick in an advantageous way. The bride speaks of the steps of love when she says in the Song of Songs, I conjure you, daughters of Jerusalem, if you encounter my beloved, tell him that I am lovesick. So it's like you're lovesick with unconsummated longings for the beloved that touched your heart with a longing for the beloved, and then lures you toward the beloved by being lovesick without the beloved. That's the first step, the willingness to be lovesick, unconsummated longings. The second step causes a person to search for God unceasingly. That is, because you're lovesick for the beloved, you unceasingly keep seeking, looking for the beloved. And so those are the steps.
Wow.
And then the third one, he says, actually, it then moves us to do things that engages us in the proximity of the beloved. So it moves us to love people more, to serve people more, to be more present, to be more engaged in the depths of life. And so that's the illusion of the 10 steps.
Wow.
And his poem is very much like this also. It's like this evolving, incremental deepening of this unitive state of love.
I love the reference to a foundation like that. That was obviously a foundation of his understanding of faith and what he's writing.
That's right. We're going to see in East Coker in the next section, there's a long quote from St. John of the Cross. It's quite lovely. We'll spend time with it. It's beautiful.
Well, Jim, we're coming towards the end of our time, and it's just been such a gift to unpack that beautiful session with you today. So thank you for doing that. Before we close, I am curious to know how you chose and why you chose the specific parts from the poem that you chose for that session.
I mean, my sense of this poem is it's very rich and beautiful, but it's not a light read and can be disheartening. So what I try to do is stay with the passages that seem more experientially accessible. And avoid stanzas that have a density of their own, that make it unnecessarily dense and get in the way. I want to give a key example. One of the most stunning passages in Burnt Norton is the still point. I'll just read the first 3 sentences. At the still point of the turning world, neither flesh nor fleshless, neither from nor towards, at the still point there the dance is. But neither arrest nor movement, and do not call it fixity, where past and future are gathered, neither movement from nor towards, neither ascent nor decline, except for the point, the still point. There would be no dance, and there is only the dance. I can only say there we have been, but I cannot say where, and I cannot say how long, for that is to place it in time. That's beautiful. But that would be the whole talk, would be that stanza.
Wow, yeah.
It's touching on a very deep point on exemplar causality in Catholic theology, that when God created us, God did not have to think up who we might be. Through all of eternity, God the Father eternally contemplated us in the Word. Since everything in God is God, this is the divinity of us before we were created. That's the still point.
Wow.
So I can't say for how long, it's eternal. But to take that on is it's a subtlety of it.
Yes.
So I tried to stay away, or I also tried to stay away from interesting little pieces that are very interesting and insightful, but they're kind of little sidebars,
Yes.
Nuancing other little phrases about it. And so that's how I decided. I tried to keep it lean so the listener can follow a thread and kind of sit with it as a way to pray. That's one of the big things that's guided me.
Yes, yes. Well, it's really helpful to understand that. And so if people are pursuing the full poem on their own, it's a lot to take on. You read it very slowly when you take it on yourself, Jim.
There's a spiritual teacher I like very much, Brother David Steindl-Rast. He's a Benedictine and has lovely works on gratitude. And I was with him years ago in Boulder, Colorado at a Buddhist Christian conference with Pema Chodron. And he was there. And we started talking about 4 quartets, and he pulled his copy out, and he had his hardbound.
Wow.
I was going to have mine hardbound too, but I've been reading this for 40 years. So you have to kind of enjoy the poetic density and sit with it and walk with it. And anyway, that's my sense of what guides me.
Jim, thank you for this wonderful dialogue. Thank you and T.S. Eliot for opening our eyes to how time can kind of trap us away from this eternal beauty that we long for. So thank you for today.
Thank you.
And thank you in the background to Dorothy, our new team member, and Corey for supporting us in this new season. Thank you for listening to this episode of Turning to the Mystics, a podcast created by the Center for Action and Contemplation. We're planning to do episodes that answer your questions. So if you have a question, please email us at podcasts@cac.org or send us a voicemail. All of this information can be found in the show notes. We'll see you again soon.
Do you feel called to walk a more contemplative path? The Center for Action and Contemplation is an educational nonprofit supporting the journey of inner transformation. Our programs and resources will help grow your consciousness, deepen your prayer practice, and strengthen your compassionate engagement with the world. Learn more about our resources, such as publications, podcasts, email series, and events at www.cac.org.